never forgetting the day they first met. He is Reinhard von Fuchlid, Cain of the unified continent. He told the young boy that he was likely to become a villain, and all the continents would perish by his hands. The king said that was the reason he had killed the boy countless times, but it was impossible to change his predestined fate. He had also witnessed countless failures, and saw the world destroyed every time, leaving only despair behind. So he decided to become even more ruthless. But in the end, on the day his grandson was born, he felt as if he were embracing hope. The boy was named Cain von Euclid. Now his grandfather wants him to follow his path, for if he cannot change the future, he will make sure the boy is strong enough to face the fate that awaits him. And so 13 years passed, and the protagonist went on a long journey with his grandfather. Currently on the fourth continent, ruled by foreigners, a man is attempting to strike a deal, offering a woman as a bargaining chip. She begs to be saved, claiming she has children. On the other side, a lord's attendants beg him to do something. Then the lord asks the man if he feels no shame using a woman as a hostage, even as a warrior. The man replies that no matter what the lord says, the outcome depends on his decision, until suddenly someone appears, asking if this man is Kurogami Makuro, the black wolf demon. Kurogami asks who dares to confront him, and the protagonist simply says that Kurogami is about to fall to evil before he can do anything. The protagonist defeats him with a single blow. Apparently his years of training have prepared him well, for he has a coldness in his eyes that mirrors the way he fights. The observing lord asks who this person is that just killed the hostile warrior, but the protagonist does not answer him, and soon after he charges forward, defeating one of the lord's men. The lord sees this and is stunned. He quickly goes on the offensive, but the protagonist counters with ease, and the lord realizes he's lost control amidst the chaos. One of the lord's attendants prepares to defend him, and the protagonist simply stands there, watching her. Before being struck, he states that the hostage was an accomplice of the man who was killed. The lord refuses to believe that could be true, but the protagonist says that if they search their pockets, they'll find proof. They proceed to search their pockets. Then the lord finds a plaque bearing the Kokumi insignia, and is shocked by the revelation. After that, they thank the protagonist for his help, and he says he only did what anyone would have done. By the way, the lord asks how the protagonist knew the enemies were from Kokumi. He replies that he didn't know. He simply attacked evil. Later, the protagonist visits a tavern to report what happened, and there his work is praised, but his master still has some doubts, and asks how Cain was so sure the hostage was an accomplice. After all, she didn't seem like a hostile person. He then asks what Cain would have done if the woman were innocent. Cain simply says he was sure they were accomplices. He shows an item his master gave him years ago. This item revealed that the two were villains, which is why he was certain. The item is a sacred crucifix, a divine artifact from the third continent. Upon seeing his grandfather's reaction, Cain asks if this artifact was stolen. After all, his grandfather always told him never to commit bad deeds, but the grandfather says there was no other way, for there was no other means to interfere with his grandson's fate. Cain asks if it was truly necessary to steal treasures from other continents, but his grandfather tells him not to question him. Instead, he wants to know if it's true that the sacred item revealed the villains. The protagonist affirms this, claiming that the item revealed the dark side of those people, which made it easy to discern who was a villain or not. His grandfather says that the sacred ring recognized Cain, and finally his celestial Death Star was freed from the shackles of predestined fate. It truly is a terrible fate, to have to go so far just to finally reach neutrality with destiny. Cain has been with his grandfather for 13 years, yet still can't understand his view of fate. The grandfather tells him not to think too much about it, because if he knew what he knows, he'd be worried for the rest of his life. More than that, his body has become like a beast, and he states that Cain is undoubtedly his grandson. The protagonist asks if that's supposed to be a compliment. His grandfather says it depends on how he takes it. At night, they lie down to sleep, but before that, Reinhard tells his grandson that there's nothing tying him down anymore, so he can live freely from now on. Cain says that from good to good, and from endless malice to evil, he will live freely within the bounds of his grandfather's teachings. Hearing these words brings peace to the old man. The next day, the protagonist wakes up and sees a letter. It said it was a symbol of the end of his journey. His grandfather wrote it and guided him to walk his own life, free from fate. He also wanted to say something crucial. The grandfather made it very clear that no matter what anyone tells his grandson, he must never believe he is a villain. Lastly, he tells Cain to seek the blacksmith Kel in the central continent. He will become a valuable ally on his journey. After some time, Cain is already facing new enemies. He gives them no chance to recover, and coldly defeats them with ease, until one of them says Cain isn't bad at fighting, but since they insulted Kuromi, he can't let him go. But this man wasn't prepared for what happened next, because the protagonist took him down and even threatened the remaining men. Even so, they didn't back down and went on the attack. Because of that, Cain couldn't just stand by, and took down one of them, just like he did with their leader. As for the other, he let him live, and while beating him badly, The man begged for his life, but the protagonist didn't go easy on him. He says it's really hard to beat someone without killing them. Lying on the ground, the man says he's just a worthless member of his clan. The protagonist already knows that. The man asks how, and Kane says it's because he's white. He also says he sees potential for rehabilitation in this man, and suggests he reflect on his life in prison. After that, he picks up an enemy sword and says it's not bad, he'll use it. And up above, he sees a fortress with a strong light shining. He remembers that he met the man who's emitting that light through his grandfather, and says he'll lead the rest to him. Up high, an old man watches what's happening below. He sees that a foreigner defeated 20 Kurogami men at once, and beyond that, noticed his presence despite the distance, so he can't be an ordinary person. However, he wonders why this foreigner left one of the men alive, saying it's as if that man's fate had been entrusted to him, until his thoughts are interrupted by his disciple. She asks what the master is doing on top of this place. He replies that this is his resting spot. Then the master walks away from the disciple, but she follows him insistently. Shortly after, he reaches the survivor, saying he almost let him slip away. His student asks who this person is. He replies that it's a Kuromi. Right away, his student asks if she should kill him. The master says this man must be judged by the law, not executed, but the girl asks what would happen if he causes trouble again. Shounen says that those fated to become villains cannot be reformed, and believes he should deal with him immediately. However, her master says that this was requested by someone whom this man attacked. Then Shounen asks how someone made that request from such a distance. She also doesn't believe her master's presence was detected from that far, since even the master's own students can't sense his presence when needed, including herself. She only found her master once because she knew that place was his favorite. In turn, the master says the child who located him has sharp eyes. The girl asks if the person who did this is the same age as her. Her master replies that yes, he is. He also sees that the sword used by this person broke, which means he cannot defend himself using only his inner energy. Soon Shounen says that at the very least, the boy is superior to her in physical arts and swordsmanship. Central Continent, an autonomous region created to promote peace among all continents, where people from all over the world gather and live together. He is also a famous place, filled with specialties and renowned products from every continent. Right at the port is where trade happens. The protagonist goes there specifically to look for the man mentioned in his grandfather's letter, until he is approached by a girl who asks if he is interested in acquiring a fortune. However, the protagonist declines and starts to leave. Then she asks if the protagonist knows the priestess from the second continent, the one who can see destiny, and tells him to go find her. Another one approaches and says she would like to meet this seer, asking if the vendor could tell her fortune. The vendor asks what she would like to know. The woman says she can see the destinies of others, but not her own. The protagonist notices this woman, and sees that she is from the Silver Fox clan. Then she turns and asks if the protagonist is bothered by her ears and tails. He apologizes for staring, but she says there is no need to apologize, and states that she just thought he might be interested in her. She says that's a destiny she would like to have, and also says they could gain fortunes together, one covering for the other, but the protagonist refuses. Then the woman says there's no deeper meaning behind it. It's her first time in the Central Continent, and she's a little hesitant to consult her fortune alone. Because of that, she says there's a gentleman also curious about his fate, so they could team up, but again, the protagonist declines and walks away. The fox girl says that in that case she will also go, and the vendor gets frustrated since she couldn't sell anything. On the other hand, the fox's companion asks if she should do something about it. She replies no. Her companion calls her princess and says those villains are using the fame of the priestess who can see fate. They're using her name for business. The princess says that if she reacts to every little thing like this, it'll never end, and decides she's more interested in the man she met earlier. Muriel asks how she could have fallen in love at first sight, but the princess claims there was a misunderstanding about that. She says she was interested in that man because of what she saw about him. Muriel asks what that was. The princess refers to his fate, saying that even for her, someone who can see the destinies of others, she couldn't comprehend that man's destiny. She also says his destiny is perfectly flawless, colorless, and odorless. It was the first time in her life that it happened, so she couldn't help but speak to him. Muriel asks if they should investigate the protagonist's fate. The princess says no, because she believes she'll meet him again either way. Her companion reminds her that the fox girl said she couldn't see it, but the princess says that instead of his fate, she saw something else, and the two buy train tickets. The princess mentions that, strangely enough, they both share the same destiny, and for some reason when she saw him, she remembered an old gentleman she met 10 years ago. He also had a mysterious destiny, and she wonders where he is and what he's doing now. Muriel suggests that this man might be the villain who stole the treasure. The princess knows he's a villain, but the old man told her that destiny is something you understand for yourself. If you can't see anything, you have to act on your own. For some reason, those words are stuck in her mind. That's why she tries to see something different from destiny. Unconsciously, she looks at the train ticket and feels a desire to meet him again. Meanwhile, the protagonist saw a Silver Clan woman who seems to be the same age as him, and she was talking about destiny, so he wonders if she is the one his grandfather spoke about. He thinks about his own destiny. 3 stars strongly affect the constellation he was born under. One of them is a priestess who can see fate, a girl from the Silver Fox clan. She is fated to pierce his heart with a spear. But it's strange, the priestess who can see destiny is supposedly his enemy, yet instead of hostility, she showed kindness. Cain wonders if it's because his fate has tilted toward neutrality, and if that's the case, he wonders if other destinies have changed too. According to his grandfather's words, more than 20 people were fated to kill him, and those are the major destinies. If you include the minor ones as well, it's over 100, twisting each of those destinies. Escaping death, that is the initial and final goal of his journey. After traveling by train, he arrives at the capital Barakal, in the center of the continent, and comes across a shop called Ironheart. Cain enters and says he's looking for something. The attendant asks what he needs. The protagonist says he's looking for the blacksmith, Cal Dipol. The girl thinks he wants a specialized weapon, and says that to see Cal, he needs an appointment. Instead, he shows her an item and asks if she can give it to Cal. She doesn't know what it is, but the protagonist insists that Cal will know, and asks her to deliver it to him. Cain also doesn't know the contents. His grandfather told him not to open it, and said that if Cal still refuses to meet after seeing what's inside, he'll leave peacefully. Then the girl understands and says Cal must be on his break, and asks the protagonist to wait a moment. Meanwhile, Cain, through his amulet, senses that this girl is not evil. After waiting a bit, another blacksmith appears. He says the girl should have just kicked out such an annoying customer. Cain thinks that unlike the girl, this blacksmith is a bad person who deserves to be killed immediately. The blacksmith says that if someone wants to meet him, they should use money instead of such a poor method, and if they want to become VIPs, he'll definitely need them. But the protagonist asks if he takes any responsibility. He also asks what kind of person calls themselves Heart and Iron. Cain sees a third-rate sword there that the blacksmith could take responsibility for. Despite his appearance, he seems to understand his place. But upon closer inspection, the swords look flashy on the outside but are poor in quality. It's a sword that perfectly matches this blacksmith, and judging by the blacksmith's reaction, he was the one who placed it there, probably to deceive travelers who aren't familiar with swords, and just by slightly swinging the sword, it broke, and the protagonist asks if the blacksmith intends to take responsibility. The blacksmith can't believe it, because regardless of the replica's quality, the sword broke with a single motion, until someone appears saying it's been a while since he visited the shop, but it looks like something interesting is going on. He is Cal, and he demands that the blacksmith explain himself immediately. The blacksmith tries to blame the protagonist for breaking the swords, and says the guard should arrest him, but Cal tells the deputy manager Din to shut his mouth, and asks why such trash was placed in this sanctuary. Cal is outraged at the manager, and demands an explanation, but the man's reaction says it all. Now he understands why the rumor about defects in their weapons spread. He states that such knowledge cannot be ignored, and tells Din to be ready, because he'll pay dearly for staining this store's name. Cal's assistants remove the man from the store as he begs for forgiveness, but instead he's called trash. In a desperate attempt, Din starts defaming the protagonist, claiming that he belittled Cal's swords, saying he couldn't guarantee their strength. He also said that even if Cain had money, he wouldn't buy third-rate swords, but Cal tells Din to shut up and says he'll deal with him later. Along with the protagonist, Cal asks if what Din said is true. Surprisingly, Cain replies that it is. Cal says he had high hopes for him, because when he saw he had brought an item from his old friends, he was surprised. But now he tells Cain to leave and pretend this never happened. The protagonist sees that apparently this branch was what was in the box. After that, Cal gives him a reward, saying that among the items currently discarded, it's one of the 3 most famous swords, but apparently the protagonist didn't like it, and Cal remembers that he had said it wasn't worth buying, so he asks what Cain plans to do. Cain says his previous statement was insensitive, and he understands if Cal took it as an insult, but he claims it's a misunderstanding, and that he had no intention of belittling the swords. He simply told the truth because it's not just Cal's swords. Any famous sword cannot withstand his strength. Then the protagonist shows proof. When he strikes with the sword, it shatters into several pieces. Cal is astonished, as he witnesses what the protagonist was talking about, and finds his strength unbelievable. The Grandmaster Blacksmith says that this strength alone puts immense pressure on the sword. He then apologizes, stating he didn't mean to insult Reinhardt's grandson. However, Cain says he should be the one to apologize for being so rude. In any case, they settle things and sit down to talk. Kale is looking at the item the protagonist brought and claims that a mistletoe branch holds great meaning. But Kane didn't even know what it was. He simply says his grandfather instructed him not to open the box, but now he wants to learn more about the branch. The blacksmith says it's a treasure among treasures. In fact, it's called a divine artifact. Kane immediately concludes that his grandfather stole this item too. He then says that for a divine item, the branch has a weak aura. But Kale explains that the branch is useful for crafting swords, and once complete, it would become a divine sword. Kale also says it's been about 20 years since he last saw one of these, and he asks for permission to forge a sword from this branch. Kane asks if Kale will give him the sword, because as he can see, he can't handle metal, and any sword he holds breaks before he can swing it 10 times. 10 years ago, after consuming the treasure of the deep sea, his body became unable to handle metals, not just iron, but even materials like orichalcum and nithril are all destroyed when Kane touches them. It's no exaggeration to say that all existing weapons are made of metal. In other words, he doesn't have a weapon of his own. Kale says that hearing this reminds him of the story of the legendary creature of the ocean. And if that's Kane's condition, he understands why Reinhardt sent that branch. A weapon made of mistletoe wouldn't be affected by this condition. Kane asks if the blacksmith can make a weapon that won't be destroyed by his condition. He replies yes, and says Kane only needs to trust him with the task. The protagonist thinks he had nearly given up on ever having a weapon, and this seems to be the last gift from his grandfather. But as he leaves, he sees the blacksmith's assistant complaining about a problem. Kane approaches and tries to understand what's going on. He then asks if, by any chance, manager Din ran away. She and the others apologize for letting the employee who insulted him escape. She states that Din deceived him and committed fraud, so she will make sure to catch him and bring him to justice. However, Kane asks if it's really necessary to apologize for letting him escape. Kane thinks they misunderstood him as a master from the fourth continent. They have strong personalities, so they assume that if someone holds a grudge, they'll be killed. The protagonist finds it a bit troublesome since he's not a master. If it were his grandmother in this situation, he imagines it would be much worse. The girl understands the protagonist's perspective and thanks him for it. But soon after, Kane leaves. And then, an attack event occurs. The leader of the bandits orders the others to capture the target, dead or alive. Whoever takes him down will earn 3 ounces of gold. Then the protagonist attacks him, saying that's a pretty good reward. He also says the man should protect his back better. But when he attacks, the protagonist's sword breaks, so the enemy takes advantage and counterattacks. However, the protagonist switches to hand-to-hand combat. The enemy tries to counter with his axe, but Kane grabs the axe and uses it against its original owner. One of his men starts to panic, but another tells them not to fear the target. Then the protagonist approaches and compliments his sword. He then uses it to pierce the enemy. More men appear and surround him. The protagonist takes the opportunity to strike them all at once, defeating the enemies who surrounded him. Some cowardly enemies are still alive and beg not to be attacked, claiming they have families. He defeats them too, mercilessly, until only one remains, and the protagonist says he'll let him live if he answers honestly. The enemy says he doesn't believe him and insists he'll die either way, but the protagonist says that if he doesn't believe, he can make a sword oath. This oath is highly respected in this world, so Kane swears by his sword that he'll keep his word. Now that he has made the promise, he asks the man who sent him. The bandit hesitates to respond, so the protagonist stabs his leg, asking if he's really going to refuse to answer. Agonizing in pain, the man replies that Din Kospel sent everyone, something the protagonist had already suspected, and asks what path the request followed. The man says there's a large organization based in Barakal. Din used his connections to get them involved. The fact that Din is part of a criminal organization is not surprising, and Kane assumes that working as a fraud in the shop wasn't the full extent of what he could do. Then he asks where the organization's base is. The man says there are several, but Kane doesn't want to know everything. He only wants to know where Din operates. The man says the lawn rest stop is the main base of operations. The request came from there too, and the rest stop is nearby. To be sure, Kane asks if the bandit is lying. The man insists he's telling the truth. Then the protagonist pulls the sword from the bandit's leg, and the man asks if he can go now. But Kane says no, and states that he's going to kill him. The bandit starts crying, saying the protagonist made a sword oath, but Kane replies that the oath doesn't apply to him, because ever since he ate the celestial peach, mana disappeared from his body. The restrictions that are bound to mana no longer apply to him. The bandit then says that even so, a warrior should keep his word. Kane agrees with that. However, he says that for everything, there is an exception. He claims that a promise made to a villain is meaningless. After finishing off the bandit, his sword breaks again. Kane thought he could still use it for a while, but it didn't even last 10 strikes this time. As expected, he concludes that he needs a sword that doesn't break. Upon arriving at the location, it looked like a normal inn from the outside, but that only applied to the lobby and exterior, because the protagonist knows that by using the hidden passage, one can reach the basement. There are some men are talking, and one says he heard that his friend finished a job today. The other says he was lucky to find a rich young master and cut off his head. It was a place where all kinds of dangerous criminals lived. And by the way, he asks where his friend found that brat. Then someone approaches, clearly furious. It's Din Kospel, who's enraged to learn that his men failed to kill the protagonist. He tells an assassin that if he had known the man was coming, he wouldn't have assigned the task to his own men. Din thinks that this man is a skilled figure, even known in Atla. Sending him must mean his boss has certain expectations for him. So Din asks the masked man if he's making his move now, but the masked man doesn't understand the question. Then Din asks if the masked man isn't there to help deal with the target. The masked man says the only orders he received were to retrieve the information provided by Ironheart and asks if Kospel still has anything to report. Din thinks that if he hands over that information, he'll die soon after, but he has no choice since the assassin won't return empty-handed. He then gives him what he has, and the masked man is satisfied. Soon he gets up to leave. That surprises Din, who thought he was going to die. However, the masked man tells him to be quiet, saying it's too silent outside. On the other side of the door, the kidnapped boy had been told to count to 20 and keep his eyes shut. Then he asks if he can open them now, but the protagonist says not yet and puts him to sleep. The protagonist says everything's okay and tells him that when he opens his eyes, he'll be in his mother's arms. After that, Kane realizes he's not alone. The masked man asks who he is, and Din replies that this is the target he had mentioned earlier. Upon seeing the protagonist, the masked man says he's rather cruel for someone so young, and asks if it was really necessary to go so far and be so ruthless. Kane responds by saying it's ridiculous for an assassin to know the meaning of the word cruel. The masked man says all he did was decapitate the man who bragged about decapitating others and torture those who love to torture others. He also says the protagonist's opponents were weak and thinks it would have been good to show a little mercy. Kane then asks, why? Kane says that good for good and endless malice for evil. He declares that mercy is a world unfit for his enemies, and all he can offer is endless malice. The masked man becomes extremely frightened and doesn't quite understand what the protagonist is talking about. But before he realizes it, there's a sword at his neck. The protagonist manages to slash him, but his sword breaks. Even so, the wound inflicted is enough to injure the enemy. Din sees this and tries to escape, but the protagonist tells him not to move because his turn is coming. Kane sees the masked man fallen and defeated, and feels satisfied as he finally confronts Din Kospel face to face. Din, in turn, can only scream in despair. After all that, the protagonist returns to the blacksmith's shop and says that, in other words, Din was a member of Outlaw. Not only that, but he was just about to report something. He hands over the chip he took to Kale and says that for safety reasons, since this model came out before mass production, it will be difficult to find a tablet for it. Kale then says that figuring out what information Allah stole from his workshop will take some time, and he doubts he even knows what they're aiming for. That makes him uneasy. Kane says that for now, the blacksmith should be cautious. They don't know what Outlaw is planning. Kale says he won't be able to forge the sword if anything happens to him. Kale also asks about the child. The protagonist says he saved him from the bandits and asks if the blacksmith would take care of him. He explains that he doesn't trust anyone else with the boy. Kale then says he'll take on that responsibility. Kane thanks him for the help. Before he leaves, the blacksmith says he found a hidden compartment in the box from the protagonist's grandfather and discovered something, and says that the protagonist should be the one to keep it. Kane thanks him and says he'll contact the blacksmith once he finds a way to read the contents of the chip. After that, he says goodbye and leaves. Far from there, the Fox Princess and her companion arrive at the place where the protagonist was last seen, but they still don't know who caused all the destruction. She wonders if there's someone capable of wielding such power against Atla. Her companion says that, as far as she knows, there's no one like that in the central continent. The princess asks if whoever did it might be on their side. Her friend doesn't know, but states that whoever did this is cruel, so she doesn't think it's something to be pleased about. The foxgirl feels that the person went too far. Her friend says it's not a bad thing to get rid of bandits using brutal methods, and she likes having people like that around. However, they might be the type who are impossible to reason with, but the princess feels like she's seen those methods somewhere before, and says it would be good to have more people like that in other continents too. Her friend says it's possible that more people are fighting against the Atlas across the world. The princess says that whether or not that's true, she'd like to meet those people, and her friend says she'll investigate them. Late at night, the protagonist reads his grandfather's note. His grandfather wrote that if Kane is reading this letter now, then that means he went to the central continent and met Kel. He probably gave him a mistletoe branch and then asked for a sword. After that, he must have also met the priestess who can see destiny. The protagonist thinks it was all a coincidence and wonders how his grandfather could have predicted it all. His grandfather continues, writing that Cain clashed with Atla in Barakal, and if everything goes according to what he wrote, his grandson will lose his life to Atla. The protagonist walks, thinking that his body isn't in good shape right now, and if he still had mana, he wouldn't be so exhausted. Cain thinks that those who have mana don't need to sleep much, since mana energizes both the body and mind. It also helps them recover from fatigue, so they don't need much sleep. He thinks he has to do something about this drowsiness, and tries to buy a tablet, but can't. Soon he finds a store that might have what he needs, and enters, hoping they have it, but shortly after he enters the shop, the fox princess and her companion also walk in. She tells the shopkeeper that she's looking for something, an old tablet whose model name starts with TK. The vendor asks if she means the TK32DX2. He says it's becoming popular again, because recently, a charming collector also asked about it, and he warns that the last one he had was sold to that young man. Her companion says there's no way an ordinary person could afford such an old device. The princess asks if it might have been someone from Atla. Her companion responds that it's possible and says they should try to track down the buyer. So the princess appeals with her cuteness, claiming she really wants to see the device, and she tries to get some information from the seller about who bought the device. Meanwhile, the protagonist inserts the chip into the device, and he's immediately able to see the information. He realizes it's personal information about the blacksmith from the Iron Heart. Upon seeing this, he thinks it's best to inform Kale as soon as possible, but right after, he ends up encountering the priestess and her companion. Cain wonders how long she has been following him. While the girl speaks, he only notices her guardian, who remains alert at all time until something surprises him. The princess approaches the protagonist and says the strangest thing is that she still can't see his future. Her companion tells the princess to stay focused on the more urgent matters. She agrees and asks if the protagonist is a member of the Atla. This shocks her friend, as the princess was very direct with the question. Cain simply responds that he's not an Atla, quite the opposite, as he declares he's against them. Then someone shows up and interrupts the conversation. The man says he was already expecting someone to bite the bait, though he didn't imagine it would be the princess from the second continent. She recognizes this man as the Atla executive named Show Python and asks what he's doing there. While her friend stands protectively in front of her, the Atla member says it's been a while since they last met, and that's why he claims he wanted to show up personally to welcome her. However, the princess's companion tells him not to come any closer. Python says he won't, but asks why the princess decided to appear in the central continent. The princess doesn't answer, but he knows she's been investigating something about a device, and he notices that this device is in the hands of the protagonist. Cain speaks up and says it wasn't the princess who bought the tablet, but him, and asks how the man tracked the device. The Atlas says they intentionally place devices like these in second-hand shops to lure enemies of their organization, and for that reason, he thanks them for biting the bait. Regardless, he doesn't know who the protagonist is, and asks why a random person would be interested in such a device. Cain gives an evasive answer, but the man starts laughing, saying he doesn't seem like a threat, but he wants to see how they'll react to this. Then, using a remote control, he activates several speakers, the noise from which severely irritates the fox girls. This acts like a weapon against beast humans, though normal humans aren't affected. Python claims the girls will pass out, and when they wake up, they'll be in an underground prison. The princess's guardian looks at her lying on the ground, and apologizes for not protecting her. Up to this moment, the protagonist hasn't reacted. Python says he's been watching him and didn't notice anything special about him, but he can't let him go, since he needs to find out how the protagonist is involved in all this, and says he'll take him to their base for questioning. He also says he doesn't intend to hurt him, but will place handcuffs on him until they arrive, and even thanks him for helping capture the princess. Cain notices the cuffs are made of iron, so they'll be useless against him, and agrees to go with the enemy, intending to fake cooperation to learn more. Some time passes and the guardian wakes up. She tries to move, but can't, as she soon sees that she's handcuffed. She becomes worried about the princess, and the protagonist says she was taken a few minutes ago by the enemies. Nuriel notices there are no guards around, and asks if the protagonist is also an enemy of the Atla. Cain says the enemies are planning to take her sword, since there's only one like it in the world, so he can't give it up no matter what. That's why he'll crush them. The guardian says he still doesn't understand the situation and asserts that being trapped in these cuffs means he won't be able to escape easily, since even she would have trouble doing so. The protagonist simply says the flaw in these cuffs is that they're made of iron, and states that something like that can't hold him. Right after, he breaks the cuffs. He also offers to free the girl. Quickly, she's freed as well. Not only that, but the protagonist uses his ability to break the iron bars of the prison. Then he says he knows the path to where the princess was taken, and tells Nuriel to follow him. Meanwhile, the princess remains imprisoned elsewhere, and Python says Din Kospel became useless after dying, but he's happy to have finally captured the Priestess of Destiny. He also says he's grateful because thanks to this, he'll be promoted within the organization. Looking into her eyes, he says he feels an urge to rip them out and then stare at them forever. Just thinking about it makes his heart race. The princess replies that instead, she will rip his eyes out and use them as decoration. Then Python says she has a sharp tongue, and he finds that attractive. He also says his boss won't like this, but there won't be much trouble if he only rips out one of her eyes. She resists and says she will repay all the humiliation she's been put through, until Python hears someone telling him to behave. He asks who dares to interfere in his business, but as he turns around, he gets kicked by the protagonist. Not only that, Cain builds up momentum and attacks him again, not giving his opponent a chance to react. After that, he goes to the princess and asks if she's okay. She says yes and thanks him for the help. Then the protagonist breaks her shackles and says her guardian is outside. The princess wonders how he broke the shackles so easily, but before leaving, she asks if he isn't going as well. Cain says that before that, he has an interrogation to carry out and tells the princess to wait outside with her friend. Once freed, the princess leaves the room and runs into her friend. They are both happy that nothing serious happened until they start hearing some screams from inside and wonder what is going on. The princess says the protagonist is interrogating Python, and Nuriel says he broke the chains easily earlier and starts to worry about who he really is. Then Cain appears and apologizes for the delay, saying they can leave now as the place is dangerous. They ask what happened to the man who was being interrogated. Cain says he's dead and recommends they don't go in there. However, Nuriel says she needs to see it with her own eyes, but upon doing so, she regrets it because the scene she sees is horrendous. After that, they leave, and the protagonist says it's no wonder he hadn't found them earlier. After all, they set up a base on top of a mountain. Before continuing, he wants to talk for a bit and says he has something to tell the princess. He shares information about the device that neutralized the two of them before, a device that was specifically developed for beast humans. It basically forces an overload, suppressing blood flow. Cain couldn't fully grasp the detailed principles, and even Python didn't completely understand it. Nuriel says that even if they lose their strength, it's best not to use blood flow for a while. Then she and the princess thank the protagonist for this information and for helping earlier. Cain says that's not necessary. He claims that what mattered most to him was uncovering the Atlas goals, and he found out they want to collapse the entire central continent. By doing so, they would force the breakdown of peace between the 4 continents and use their influence across all of them to start a war. This way, they plan to weaken the military forces of the continents and exploit their weaknesses to dominate the world. The girls are horrified by this. Cain now understands his grandfather's words. In any case, he says that's all for now and that they should part ways. The princess says she hasn't properly thanked him yet and wants to bring him to her base. However, he says he has more urgent things to take care of, thinking that the Iron Heart shop could be attacked at any moment, so he has to return there as soon as possible. The princess doesn't let him go without a promise that they'll meet again. Cain then sets a meeting with her for the next day and says he'll be waiting at Sarah's tavern at 6 in the morning. After that, he leaves by jumping to higher ground, and Nuriel praises his skills, saying he always has a trick up his sleeve. She even compares him to the Beast King. On the other hand, the princess thinks differently. She asks her friend if she doesn't feel like this is somehow fated, since this young man is the only one in the world whose future she can't see, and he saved her life. Speaking of the protagonist, late at night, he arrives at the blacksmith's shop, and Kale asks what he's doing there so late. Cain says he accessed the chip's information and tells the blacksmith everything. After hearing that, Kale can't believe all this was happening, and he had no idea. Cain says the Atlan tend to go to war, so it's only natural they were targeting a blacksmith, especially to get the best weapons. For now, he advises the blacksmith to hide somewhere with the artisans, but Kale says that's impossible, because if he's discovered, the Atla will launch an attack. He also says that because the protagonist attacked their base, he's now being hunted. Cain apologizes, but the blacksmith reassures him. He says he'll forge the sword anyway. But there's a problem, and asks Cain if he knows about sword Triton. He explains that it's a precious metal from the second continent, which is necessary for the sword's construction, but obtaining it is very difficult, and it will take a long time to finish the sword without it. However, Cain says he knows a way to get that material. He thinks the princess can foresee destiny, and when he meets her, he asks what she knows about the metal. They meet at the tavern as planned, and the protagonist asks how he can obtain Triton. She says acquiring it isn't the issue, but explains that it will take some time, and she asks if it has to be unprocessed. The protagonist says yes. In that case, the princess says she can get it immediately, but her companion doesn't like the idea. The princess points to Nuriel's sword, but her guardian says that sword is a gift directly from the king, and she doesn't want to give it up. However, after much insistence, Muriel gives up the sword. The protagonist thanks her and says that if the princess needs information from other bases, he will provide it. She finds that a little suspicious, and asks what the protagonist's motivations are. Kane says that even if he doesn't like it, he needs to form a team. The princess asks if he's trying to form an alliance. Kane says that, as she can see, he's always on his own, but to face the Apla, he'll need allies. Then the princess asks if he trusts her. Kane says yes, and states that just by looking, he can tell they're strong. He also says he'll understand if they don't trust him right away, but the princess immediately counters that, saying she trusts him. With that, they agree to join forces. The protagonist says he doesn't know how long they'll have to work together, but says that, in the meantime, they should look out for one another. That way he gets ready to leave, saying he needs to deliver the sword as quickly as possible. Before he goes, the princess gives him a map of where they're staying and says he can visit them anytime he wants. And she also says one more thing. She reveals that her name is Shiver Vistrin. Only now does the protagonist realize that neither of them had introduced themselves formally, so he says his name is Kane. The princess says that's a beautiful name, and says she'll see him soon. Sometime later, the protagonist walks under the moonlight. Meanwhile, he thinks about how he has the Black Wolf's sword, probably the only one in the world, and has already delivered it to Kale, so that issue is settled. This way, in a week, his sword will be complete, and he'll never have to worry about constantly breaking equipment again. So he decided to go to the address the princess gave him earlier, and is surprised when he arrives. He says that, unfortunately, the rum was sold out and he couldn't buy any. However, Muriel welcomes him and says he got there quickly. She's surprised, since the protagonist had said his task was urgent. He confirms and says it was urgent, not time-consuming. Inside, a beast man wonders why Python had the noise suppression device. He had that question in mind, but didn't expect the answer to show up right in front of him. When he sees the protagonist approaching, the beast man gets scared, but Kane tells him not to play dumb, stating that he knows exactly who he is. Kane then cuts off the beast man's head, shocking everyone present. Then he says his introductions were delayed because someone got in his way, so he formally introduces himself and says he'll be living with them for a while. He then wishes for everyone to get along. After the protagonist's dramatic entrance, he draws everyone's attention, and soon he is attacked by the dead man's friend. His actions are not well received, so the others begin to attack him as well. The protagonist tries to argue that this is all just a misunderstanding. Either way, he defends himself from the attacks, until suddenly he notices that Muriel is just watching the fight, and has no intention of stepping in. Even so, he keeps fighting, but while defending from an attack, his sword breaks as always. So with no other option left, he resorts to talking, claiming that the man he killed was a spy. It's hard for the others to believe, but the protagonist insists it's true. Muriel speaks up and asks how he's so sure about that. Kane asks if she's ever heard of the Jifril school. He explains that it's a school focused mainly on body-based magic, and one of those magics is specifically body transformation. As soon as Kane cancels the spell, the others are shocked to see the true face of the dead man. The protagonist says that the magic stone inside this individual's body was responsible for the transformation, a spell that perfectly copies another person, and because of that, he claims the man was a spy for the Atla. However, Muriel still has a few doubts. First of all, she asks how he knows so much about magic when he's just a swordsman. Second, she wants to know how he was so sure that individual was a spy. To the first question, he answers that he knows all 73 magic schools on the continent and their traits, and to the second, he attributes it to an unavoidable accident caused by his obsessive-compulsive disorder. Kane recalls that his grandfather once said the malice within him is immense, and hoped that it would only be directed toward a single purpose, and that when the time came to destroy evil, his grandfather said he shouldn't hesitate and should act purely on instinct. That's why Kane says his body reacts almost unconsciously in the presence of evil. Muriel understands and says that next time he should share his plans before acting. Kane apologizes and says he'll try to stay in control from now on. He also says he spoke to the princess about what happened earlier and that a proper reward has been prepared for him. Kane asks where the princess is. Her friend reveals she's praying on the top floor and needs some time alone. She says there's no danger where the princess is, but then remembers that the person who prepared the altar was exactly the one who died. So Muriel rushes to meet the princess, but when she gets there, she sees that nothing serious is happening. The princess says that her friend's appearance must mean the lower floors were attacked as well. Her friend replies that it's more complicated than that. She says Muriel made the right decision because few could defeat her now, especially since the princess cannot be assassinated under the full moon. She also says she was attacked out of nowhere, so she used a lot of strength and regrets it, because if they had survived, they could have been captured for more information. Suddenly, she senses a strange presence nearby and runs off to see what it is. The princess thinks the intruder is hiding their presence, but says her eyes won't be deceived under the moonlight. Muriel warns the princess to be careful, and thinks the only person who could have triggered that presence the princess sensed must be Cain. She knows the princess's powers under the moonlight rival the Beast King's in his youth. Therefore, if Cain is attacked by her in that form, he won't be able to defend himself until the princess attacks Cain, and he says she's stronger than he expected. She becomes incredibly embarrassed for attacking him by mistake, and apologizes, saying she thought he was an intruder. On the other hand, Muriel is amazed that Cain was attacked by the princess and didn't take any damage, becoming even more impressed with him, because this might mean he's stronger than the Beast King. Sometime later, he shares the details with the princess and asks if there could be any connection between the Jufrel school and her ability to see destiny. She says she has the power to see other people's destinies, as long as she can see them with her own eyes, and there are no other conditions, and she believes it works by observing the target's mana. In other words, this power depends entirely on the target's mana, so if they have little mana, they can't be seen. Cain thinks that no one with mana can hide from the priestess's eyes. In terms of detection skills, that's an overwhelmingly powerful ability. Meanwhile, Muriel asks why the princess would reveal such a secret so easily. She responds that the secret is worth less than her life. Concerned, Muriel tells the protagonist that this information about the princess must not become public. However, Cain's expression changes completely. He says that, judging by the princess's reaction, she hasn't realized it yet, and claims that they are surrounded. Outside, some spies are watching them. Ratman, a member of the Atla, says that while they were fighting there, the infiltrator was playing spy. He was happy to be assigned to the item, so he should have stopped slacking and gotten the job done, and says that once this task is over, they're going to kill him. But Rashid says there's no need, since transformation through magic is high risk, so the infiltrator will be discovered and die on his own. Rahman then concludes that the infiltrator was sent for that very purpose, but Jay, another member of the organization, doesn't like hearing that. He says the infiltrator hasn't reported back for about 30 minutes, and is worried. Ratman says it's just a matter of time until they get word from the infiltrator, but the two can't agree and are about to fight to the death. Meanwhile, the commander simply watches them, and then says he'll kill anyone who draws a sword in front of him, so if they want to continue, they can go ahead. The two fighters quickly back down, afraid of their superior. Then the commander orders Jay to go check on the infiltrator's status, and if there's no contact, they'll proceed with the plan. Ratman gets excited, thinking he'll finally get the action he wanted. However, when he looks to the side, he no longer sees his companion, and is shocked by the scene. He tries to warn Jay that they're under attack, but when he looks at Jay, he sees that he's already been taken down. The protagonist approaches, saying he suddenly felt the bloodlust and thought he'd been discovered, but apparently he was mistaken. Ratman, terrified, asks who he is. He gets no answer and demands that the man in front of him identify himself, claiming that if someone asks a question, they deserve a response. But then Cain asks if Ratman is even a person, saying he's just a piece of meat, about to be chopped into pieces. After defeating the Outlaw spies, Cain picks up a sword from one of them and hopes it lasts at least 3 days. The next day, Muriel says the enemy has found them, so they need to abandon this base and find a new location, and also discard anything that might leak information, taking only the essentials. Soon after, the protagonist returns. Muriel thanks him for the help and asks how many enemies there were and what the commander's face looked like. Cain, in turn, asks if that really matters. She says it does, because that way they can prepare for what's coming. Cain says all the opponents perished. Muriel is shocked, not believing that he defeated them all in just 3 minutes, until she sees the protagonist holding a new sword. He says he took it from one of the enemies. Muriel says that's a sacred magic sword, and is surprised to see it. Cain says its former owner was called Rashid, one of the outlaw members, and the sword is Rashiberitan. They say there's nothing this magic sword can't cut. In fact, he thought the mana density was high, so he concluded it was a magic sword. Muriel says he should have known that. It's common knowledge among all swordsmen, but Cain says he's not familiar with swords. Speaking of which, Muriel realizes that Lord Cain also didn't know about the Black Wolf sword, and wonders if he might not be a swordsman at all. The princess, who had been quietly sitting in the corner until now, stands up and apologizes for the delay, saying her synchronization is complete. Cain realizes she was gathering strength to return to this state. She thanks Cain for his help but says to lead the rest to her. The protagonist quickly realizes she had been listening to their conversation the whole time. Cain tries to warn her about the enemies, but the princess says she'll take care of them all. However, he says that's not it, and reveals that he already defeated them all, leaving the princess speechless. Far away, in the capital of the second continent, in a small company located in Sorakasia, a man receives the news that they've lost communication with the swordsman. He is Van, the Thunder Emperor and executive of the Atla, and he asks his assistant if Rashid was taken down, claiming someone that strong shouldn't fall so easily. But unfortunately, his secretary confirms it and says something unexpected may have happened. She says she heard that the Princess of Vistram awakened her power and became stronger than King Fur, so that power may be what led to Rashid's defeat. Van says that indeed, if the princess's blood awakens, it will be significant.